The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello, I'm Carl Seidel, host of The People's View, sponsored by the Nashua City Republican Committee. And if you want, we meet at the Crown Plaza the second Thursday of every month. And if you want to find out more information, you can go to our website at nashuagop.org.
Welcome to The People's View.
Hello, and help me welcome Eric Eastman. Eric,
good to see you again,
welcome aboard.
Carl.
And
Thank you.
You're running again for your second term in Ward 1.
I most certainly am.
Okay, and you've
Proudly
been a
so.
very active serving the first term. So how about this? I mean, what are you going to be after when you go get up there again next January?
Well, I mean, goodness, it's true that it's easy to see the whole undertaking as a big game of football and seeing how far you can move the ball up a certain direction of the field that you want it to go. But the fact of the matter is that when we are elected, whether we're senators, representatives, whether we serve in Washington or Concord, we represent the will of the people, ideally, at least in theory. According to the founding documents, that's our job. So it's crucial that we bear that in mind, and it's crucial that not just at election time, but all the time, that we do our best to stay sensitive to the pulse of public opinion and the will of the people and be responsive to that.
And I know you're open to having people call you, talk about anything, and I think that's one way we keep in contact with our constituents.
Yeah.
And meetings like this. And I
Sure.
think we'll be continuing that during the year.
Absolutely. I see them as our boss. And, I don't see it the other way around. So.
Well, I hope our listeners are hearing that and give you a call sometime.
Sure.
Okay, I know one of the big things we have coming up is the budget, like always. The first term is the budget term. And right now, from what I can tell from the drafts that our governor has from our departments, she's asking for the same thing she did last time. Another $1 billion more and more taxes and fees. And I think if we're getting up there again, we're going to just do the same thing. We go come up with a budget that even if it's vetoed, it's happened to come back.
Oh, goodness. There's a great metaphor that was used by one of our colleagues from the House floor, and she serves on the Finance Committee, of which there are three, as you know. There are three different versions of finance, because it's a big subject, a lot to be dealt with. And it's one of our very distinguished colleagues from the Hudson, New Hampshire area. And she said from the House floor, look, my husband wants a Ferrari. He's always wanted a Ferrari. We can't afford a Ferrari, so he drives a Honda. Maybe a BMW if he's good, if I let him borrow my car. But we can't do Ferrari. So we're simply going to have to remain within our means, and our family budget is going to have to be implemented to balance our wants and our needs first. So I thought it was effective. She got a few laughs, and I wanted to do a little bit of honor to our colleague from Hudson.
Well,
that would be Lynn Ober, who said that from the House floor. And I agree with it, only in so much, and that's not too hard for anybody else to agree with, too. It's pretty straightforward. And everyone relates to the fact that your family budget has limitations, and you've got to work within the means that you've got. So why, too, would it be any different with any other budget? Can you make money rain from heaven?
That's right.
Can you squeeze more blood out of a rock that has none? No. You've got to learn to be more responsible and more prudent with what you have and identify waste or fraud or just excess as often as possible. So a lean and mean administration or a lean and mean system is really what you're after, because it's going to be that much more responsive to the needs of the people. If it's not bloated by unnecessary expenditures.
Well, actually, I mean, as it worked out, we gave them a lot of money in the different areas, especially in the healthcare and treatment of disabled people and stuff like that. In fact, it apparently is too much for them to handle because they haven't even delivered it yet. You know, I mean, the budget started in July 1st.
Sure.
And it's October now, and they still haven't distributed the money that they needed so badly.
Very
You know,
strange.
sometimes I think maybe her eyes are bigger than her stomach.
Possibly, possibly. I want to give a shout out, a little bit of credibility, or a little bit of a cred moment, to our very distinguished State Senator Kevin Avard,
Sorry.
who was a tremendous champion for services and funds for the disabled during this past biennium. And you don't get more compassionate than that. So when the old and tired and unsupportable talking point is launched usually from the left, but from whatever direction, that conservatives are more interested in the bottom line than they are in human lives. Well, that's just a fallacy, and his record of service and our voting records prove that.
And he's good in analyzing what our needs really are.
Sure.
And how they should be met. I mean, it's not that you just throw money at a problem. You have to have an analysis to see where it's going to be most effectively used.
That's correct.
And Kevin was very much in getting the Senate around to those perspectives. And he's had this interest for a long time. When he was a rep, he served on a caucus that we had for people who wanted to petition the government to right a wrong that was done to them.
Sure, sure. So in instances where there was no recourse.
Right.
So, and that's a constitutional precept. That's right there in our state constitution.
Right.
A constitution which incidentally predates the U.S. Constitution by 5 years in terms of when it was implemented.
That's right.
And it's called redress of grievances. And it's a pretty objective provision. If you feel that you haven't been treated fairly, you deserve to be able to have some type of deliberative body that you can appeal to.
That's right.
And have them look it over. Look, when a crime is committed, allegedly, what happens? You go to court. Whether it's criminal or civil, there's somebody who is the arbitrator.
Right.
Based on the proof you have to present. Why would that not be the case if you have a complaint about the way the government has been interacting with you?
That's right.
So.
And there's quite a few of those complaints. I think we need to
Sure.
look at that, and the Democratic governors that we had have completely ignored the matter of regress.
Yep.
Well,
Anyway,
let's get on with what's happening and what's going to happen.
Sure.
Instead of just looking back. Let's look forward to another good year where we do a good analysis on our needs and find some way of supporting those needs.
Sure. Sure.
Do you have things that, I know you're on the Veterans Committee, as I believe you're...
Yep. Veterans Affairs and State and Federal Relations. So both areas are kind of squished together, and we deal with a lot of very interesting legislation.
Let's look at the Veterans area. Are you seeing anything that's needed for the veteran services here in New Hampshire that is handled by the state, not by the federal government? Because I know on the federal government side, they're badly in need of reorganization.
It's a mess, yeah. Well, I mean, the state and the federal government behave in a partnership oftentimes when dealing with veterans' health issues and the administration over and the dispersal of health services. And that reform in that area is far from complete. It's far from over. There's still a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of waiting lists. There's still a lot of incomplete services made available. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not sort of dumping on the existing services that are in place here in New Hampshire. They're wonderful, and I get feedback from veterans a lot who say that what they do well. What they do with professionalism and compassion, and they do it very expeditiously. So they try their best. But their resources and the breadth of the services they have to offer are limited. Oftentimes it is the case that a veteran who's relying on their veterans' benefits has to leave the state to deal with illnesses that don't fall within the purview of what's available in Manchester or other places, and so that's the way it's got to go. So a big trip to get to a doctor for health maintenance issues is not a great it's not a great thing to have to live with if you have to get in the car and drive 3 hours or whatever it is.
Yeah.
There's better ways to go about it. So that's certainly a sore spot, and it's something that continues to need to be looked at. And it's not going to be an overnight solution. So no one's proposing, certainly not myself, that if we wave a magic wand and we redirect some funds from the general fund or what have you, that we can conjure up a whole new hospital
Yeah.
or a whole new array of services. This is something you have to work at over time. But to rest on your laurels and assume that the status quo is going to be acceptable for another 2 years and to get into that rhythm where you're merely doing that is really not addressing the problem. So health issues are always paramount to everybody, and certainly to veterans too.
Well, what about the other areas of the federal affairs that you have to be concerned with that come up within your purview of your committee?
Ensuring that honor is given where honor is due is, I think, another very, not only poignant, but proper thing to pay attention to. Let me give you one example. A young man who had been a recent, I don't want to say conscript, voluntary joiner of one of the branches. It could have been the Army, I don't remember.
Yeah.
But he prevailed upon an existing sitting rep to draft some legislation so that he could wear his uniform at graduation.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
That came through our committee. And we dealt with that as fairly as we could, and there were a couple of suggested amendments and changes in language, but ultimately it did pass our committee and went to the House floor, and you remember that vote. Another one had to do with placing some type of commemorative plaque or something of significance that called attention to the ultimate sacrifices that had been made by alumni of a given high school, whether it's public high school, private, charter school, what have you. The opportunity for somebody to opt in to that idea at their school campus was something that somebody felt was a good idea. Now, the word is opportunity, which meant they just wanted it to be possible for someone to look at it.
That's right.
And then their town council would vote on it, and they would do their thing. But just the idea that they didn't have the opportunity to put that idea forward in their municipality, they found that to be an egregious affront to the honor of those who had served in uniform and had graduated from their local high school. So we wrestled with that one too. And I put those in kind of the category of giving honor where honor is due. And if you've signed that contract where you say that, yes, if ordered to do so, and if circumstances call upon me to do so, I will put my life on the line for the freedom of my country. Now, I don't care what age you are. It takes a grown-up to do that.
Definitely.
And an honorable person. So those who have done it, and heaven forbid, have actually paid that price, they deserve to be given that honor. So, that's my take on the matter. So
you're just saying that this is just an example of some way regulations work in this state, that you have to go through the state legislature sometimes just to resolve what could be, something that you can just talk over like you and I and say, sure, that's a good idea.
Right. It should be an objective matter and not require some sort of statutory protection
or pressure
in order for people to take that initiative.
That's right.
It's kind of strange to me. But
well, that's part of our job, is to see that some of these things get paid, they pay attention to.
Exactly.
And paying attention to something, we got this heroin problem that is around. And while we put in enough money up to address it, we really haven't gotten the proper action yet.
No, we haven't. And what we have to bear in mind is that this is solutions to this, I guess it's fair to call it an epidemic, this social scourge, are going to best be orchestrated regionally. So coordination of efforts, including budgets, including dispersal of services and what have you, or implementation of services, is going to have to be looked at from somewhat more of a bird's eye view for it to be effective. Because this stuff is crossing state lines.
Yeah.
Right? We live in New England, which is an aggregation of 6 states, and we need to look at it as a regional issue because the very crafty and very enterprising distributors of this stuff,
Oh, yeah.
they don't see state lines.
No.
They see a region, they see a marketplace, and they're leveraging that marketplace as cleverly as they can, and with great success. And it's a terrible thing.
Unfortunately.
So on one side of that, on one side of this big bunch of problems is how do we tamp down and inhibit the influx of the substance to our streets. But on the other side of it, and I think the somewhat more interesting side, is how do we offer rehabilitative services, and how do we offer a way out, and how do we approach this compassionately so that people aren't demonized or stigmatized
Right.
because they got ensnared in an addictive behavior that really could happen to anyone. And so taking away that stigma is a tough thing to do, but it's something we need to pay attention to doing.
I think it's just starting to wake up to something like that. I mean, but you really have to start really with the education in the early ages, and you have to help the person who wants to be cured or clean and follow up and make sure that they don't fall into a relapse of their
That's right.
of the habit, because it's very easy to do. And you're only seeing bits of that approach now. I think it just has to be expanded. Maybe that's be our job in the next session.
Right. I agree with the opioid. It's an interesting word that I hadn't heard before this last 2 years, because I know there's a lot of synthetic spin-offs from heroin and the molecular structure of heroin, so they call it opioid crisis. And so that task force that was convened here in New Hampshire to deal with this crisis, and I know I'm using air quotes, but I think crisis is a fair term to use, and a lot of terms being thrown around. That was a good first step in order to set the bar for how serious this is and for how much of our know-how needs to be mobilized, and the level of priority that it deserves to be given. But we can't stop there just because we had the task force and they did their thing for a couple of months. And I had a couple of friends who are colleagues who were on that task force, and you know, there was a lot that they had to wrestle through because it's not just a social problem, it's not just a legal problem or a criminal problem, it's a health problem. So it's a very broad-based issue. But we need to bear in mind that we can't rest on our laurels thinking that, well, we paid big attention to it and it made a lot of press. So now we as public policymakers are indemnified from being guilty for what's happening on the streets. Because it's not about looking good, looking like you're doing something, but actually stopping people from dying.
Wow.
So our job is to do what we can with policy to make sure that the vital resources get to where they need to get fast, and we don't sit around in big rooms, act important, and keep talking.
Right. That's what you have to avoid. You have to make sure your money's doing the job that you just have it set out to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Say, there is one other really interesting subject matter that's come across my attention in the committee that I sit on, and I wanted to share a little bit about that, if I may. And in our committee, we hear things called resolutions. And resolutions are proposals that a state take a formal stand on a certain subject. It could be about anything. It could be about supporting a group of nationals from a particular part of the world who are encountering some trouble with their government, and they may happen to have a community in our state. So they ask for a resolution. We actually did hear a resolution dealing with the Bhutanese population, which I thought had a lot of merit. But a resolution, or a group of them that I heard a bunch of over the last couple of years, dealt with the question of whether or not holding what's known as an Article 5 Convention of States is or isn't a good idea. And I know that I'm somewhat new to the subject, and other legislators who have more time in have heard about this
Well, that's something we might want to
way before me.
Yeah, describe a little bit more for our audience, because
Sure.
most people haven't heard about a convention of states.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. Well,
But it's been
simply
around
this.
for a while now. People are trying to get it done
That's exactly
for one
right.
reason or another.
Well, it's merely a mechanism that's built into the Constitution.
Right.
In Article 5, the first 1 through 4 articles deal with defining the different branches of government and their roles. And it was very astute of George Mason and a few other of the framers of the Constitution back in 1787, 8, and 9 to realize that, hey, wait a minute, I know we're pitting ambition against ambition, you know, which is the idea of checks and balances. That's the theory behind it. But what if one or more of the branches of the federal government kind of goes off the rails and starts to accrue more power unto itself and abuse that power? What recourse does the people have, or do the people have?
In a way that they might not imagine right now.
That's
Something
correct.
different.
That's correct. So in this election year where everybody's thinking about top ticket politics mostly, thinking about whether it's Trump or Clinton or 4 years prior it was 2 other names that we were thinking about. But it's easy to get distracted by the notion that a strong leader can fix everything, or a strong leader can put a badly listing ship right. Well, the captain can't do it all. He needs the crew. So what Article 5 speaks to is the fact that state legislators, like you and I, have the prerogative as individual states to pass a resolution, which also serves as an application to Congress, to tell Congress that state legislatures, as a majority, want to meet and talk about a couple of problems they see happening in the country, that they think they may be able to dream up some new amendments to the Constitution to properly address. So it just says, look, Congress, you can cook up amendments to the Constitution. We, the states, still have to vote on whether or not they're going to become a part of the Constitution. That's called the ratification process. But that same ratification process applies in either case. The other part of Article 5 refers to the fact that state legislators or legislatures can send these resolutions / applications to Congress to say, hey, guess what? We're going to meet, if 2/3 of those legislatures throughout the 50 states say the same thing, we're going to meet and talk about a balanced budget amendment. We're going to talk about term limits. We're going to talk about things that are on a lot of people's lips.
That's right.
And if 2/3 of them do that, guess what? Congress's job is to step back and name the time and place of that gathering of state legislators, and then let it happen. So that's how it works.
Now, one of the things that people are worried about with that is whether there's any way of limiting the area that they're going to deal with.
Yeah.
And how is that being dealt with now? Do they have that same objection?
Well, oh, sure. A lot of people have those same objections, and they're very prudent and very mature to think in terms of what could go wrong.
Right.
And I don't blame them a bit. That's just called approaching a situation in a Socratic way. You ask all the right questions, right? Well, the fact of the matter is, I happen to have attended the first simulated Article 5 Convention of the States, all 50 states, that's ever happened in our nation's history in Williamsburg, Virginia, just late last month.
Oh, appropriate.
Less than a month ago, yes. And it was organized by a group that calls themselves Citizens for Self-Governance. And the Convention of the States organization operates under their umbrella. And it's populated with law professors and legal eagles that have done some extraordinary things in this country. One case is in front of the Supreme Court on a variety of issues. So you've got some people that are very, very astute who are involved in this. And for having that kind of legal firepower on their side, they were able to orchestrate this simulated Convention of the States dealing with some of those very issues that I mentioned to you a moment ago. I attended.
Somebody tried to get it outside the limits, and you were able to slap them down, or what?
Well, I don't know that we had to do a lot of slapping. The point of a gathering like that, based on what the Constitution says, is that it can only occur If all the applications
Right.
from all the states have comparable specificity, which means they have to revolve around the same subject, i.e., we're going to meet and talk about term limits. We're going to meet and talk about a balanced budget, or the size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government, or federal or judicial overreach at the federal level, stuff like that. So you've got to be very specific with your language in each of your applications, i.e. resolutions, from each state, in order for each of those applications to aggregate and then ultimately become 2/3 of the states. If they don't aggregate, guess what? You don't have a ball game. So the only way the ball game can go forward is if you meet those criteria. Once that happens, that's the subject matter, that's the scope of the discussion, and that's what you're there to talk about. Whatever comes out of such a gathering, if it happened for real, well, guess what? Those ideas are subject to the scrutiny of all the states.
Right.
And they have to decide whether or not that ought to be a constitutional change.
What's next with this group? What are they going to do next?
Well, now that we've got what we like to think of as proof of concept,
Yeah.
right?
A little bit, anyway, and I'm sure somebody might.
I realize
go into
everybody
that
who was
nitpick
there
on that.
on the playing field was a friendly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, there's that. But the fact is, what we've demonstrated is that if you follow Mason's rules and you follow what constitutional provisions exist that we know about, that we have to go by, you can have a pretty good, good outcome. So what's next for this organization is probably just to promote the heck out of what we accomplish in that instance and help other legislators to see that there's more to the discussion than they may have heard so far.
Well, how many states were represented down there?
All 50.
All 50.
All 50.
Very
There were
good.
3 from New Hampshire.
But not that many have already considered resolutions, have they? There's some. My understanding is 30-some instead of.
Well, this is not a new subject
By the
necessarily.
way, not to rush you, but we only have a few seconds left.
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot of states have been looking at this for a long time,
Yeah.
dealing with issues that have been of concern to the American people, and it continues. New Hampshire has wrestled with a balanced budget amendment in the past, and they indeed passed a resolution 4 years ago in 2012. So much to its credit, in my opinion, it did that. So it's an ongoing conversation and a very spirited one. And people from both sides of the aisle find it to be very intriguing as a solution.
Well, Eric, sounds like we have a lot to look at this session.
It certainly does.
So good luck in getting elected again.
Thank
Coming
you, sir.
back,
You
and
as
we'll
well.
join you up there.
Very good.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.